I can go and stand with my horses and they can turn and look at me. I don't have a treat. They're not interested. The donkeys, as soon as they see me, they come wandering over. And Shinto, the one we bred, he likes to lean. Doesn't want a treat, doesn't want anything. He just wants to lean on. And that can be such a lovely experience. If as an animal trainer, you just think horse responses, then you will get frustrated because it won't work the same way.
At Horse Chats today, we're introducing another Equitana educator, and this person's Chase Day. And we're going to ask her a few questions about why do horse people need donkeys. But before we do that, I'd like to just remind you about International Horse College. Now, if you'd like to work in the horse industry but not sure where to start, then have a chat to the friendly team at International Horse College. With their wide variety of horse courses from complete beginner to qualified professional, and students in over 20 countries, they'll be able to consider your individual requirements and guide you in the right direction. Simply go to internationalhorsecollege.com now to start the conversation. Registered Training Organisation 31352. So, Chase, welcome to Horse Chats.
Thank you.
Chase, normally I get guests on and ask them what their inspirational quote is, because we only have we have half hour, 45 minutes to get to know you a bit more. And I know that you're speaking at Equitana on behalf of the Donkey Society of Victoria. But tell us your personal quote that you'd like to use. And it could be a personal inspirational quote, something that inspires you, something you might find that you say regularly to people. Have you got something that you'd like to tell us just to let us know a little bit more about you?
Okay, so I have got a quote here. It's by a gentleman called Albert Schweitzer. And it's a bit of a sort of statement. And it says, for animals that are overworked, underfed, and cruelly treated, for all wistful creatures in captivity that beat their wings against bars, for all that are hunted or lost or deserted or frightened or hungry, for all that must be put to death, and for those who deal with them, we ask a heart of compassion and gentle hands and kindly words.
Does that reflect a lot about the Donkey Society?
It does. One of the reasons that I have been so passionate about bringing donkeys to Equitana is that they sadly are often seen as the second-class citizen of the equine world. And it's Equitana, it's not Horsetana. And donkeys, because of their stoic nature, really do suffer a lot in the world. I also volunteer with a charity that works in the third world to help animals, and donkeys are quite front and center in the work they do because they are usually cheaper and easier to get than a horse. They will work longer and harder. They carry bigger weights per kilo than a horse can. So they really do suffer in the world. And I think it's important for people to meet donkeys and to realize what absolutely wonderful animals they are and how they really do need to be acknowledged and appreciated by anybody that loves equines.
You're the treasurer of the Donkey Society of Victoria. So the Donkey Society of Victoria, as I understand, the purpose of the society is to promote the well-being of donkeys in Australia if they're wild or domesticated, and encourage the breeding of sound quality donkeys, and also to provide education on the care of donkeys, promoting research into matters relating to donkeys and encouraging and supporting the exhibition of donkeys and participating in the prevention of cruelties. So you were a horse person before your donkey life, or, before you became interested in donkeys. Did you have an interest in donkeys early aligned with horses, or how did you, change your interest from horses to donkeys?
So I did have donkeys in England, probably in my early 20s. My family did purchase a couple of donkeys after we fell in love with them, seeing them in Morocco. I moved to Australia about 25 years ago, and we had horses. And then sadly, a couple of our horses died and of old age, and we had a bit of a gap in the paddock. And I said to my husband, I'd really like to get some donkeys. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I joined the Donkey Society Facebook page, and there was a sale coming up down near Geelong, and they'd run a mob of wild-caught donkeys through the sales. So we went down and we picked up 2 of these wild-caught donkeys, and that's how a lot of people actually get into donkeys, is buying unhandled wild donkeys, and we reached out to the community and got some help and assistance with them and just absolutely fell in love with them. I mean, we do still have a few horses, but we're slowly transitioning across to probably being a pure donkey property because they're just amazing.
So you talk about donkeys being stoic. Now, some people will call them stubborn, but you're saying stoic. It sort of changes the perception, I think, of donkeys and people's attitude towards donkeys. So instead of calling them stubborn, being stoic is an asset. It's something that they are. And thinking about, my little experience with donkeys, if you say stoic, then I think, yeah, absolutely. Working longer, working harder, less flighty. They've certainly got some assets and some personality traits that we can value.
So one of the things that we work against being donkey people is the horse is treated as sort of the default equine model. So a donkey is not a horse. They separated from horses millions of years ago. They're more closely related to a zebra. So if you try to compare a horse to a donkey using horse criteria, they're going to be different. So one of the things is a horse is a plains animal. If you're going to run away from danger, you're in a big herd, you're on the plains, that's something that is a good strategy. A donkey is a desert animal. They live in scrubbier, rockier areas in the wild. They don't live in large herds. So to be scared of something and to run away from it isn't necessarily a sensible response. So they tend to process a bit more. So they look at something and have a think about it. And so when a donkey, I mean, they do still spook and stuff, but nowhere near like a horse. So they'll look at something, and if they think it's dangerous, well, they won't have a bar of it. So it's more about as a trainer. So for instance, if you want to put a donkey in a float, a horse will normally give you lots of energy. They'll go, oh, I don't want to go in that float. So they'll go to the left, they'll go to the right, they back up. So a horse trainer learns to redirect energy to where they want it to go. Whereas a donkey will look at a float and just stand at the bottom of the float going, I don't think that looks like a great idea. So you have to be more creative in trying to figure out how to get the donkey to go in there. So it's not that they're being stubborn. A donkey doesn't think like that. It's just that their way of responding to a fearful stimuli is very different to a horse's. So if as a animal trainer you just think horse responses, then you will get frustrated because it won't work the same way. Whereas if you approach with sort of imagination and with, being prepared to think outside the box, then you can find solutions to figure a donkey out. And again, with the stoicism, they measure differently on the pain scale. So it'd be much harder to tell if a donkey is in pain because they are so stoic. They will endure much more discomfort without registering signs of pain. So you have to be much more prepared to know your animal and to really look for signs, because it might just be a tightening of the eye or a tightening around the lips or something that's indicating that they're uncomfortable, rather than, obvious pawing and kicking and stuff that a horse would do. So all of those negative connotations, the words that donkeys are given for their personality, is usually because people are going horse as the default, and then because the donkey responds differently, they get the negative terminology that would be applied to a horse that was behaving like that, instead of going, well, this is a completely different animal. How does it work? Yeah.
No, I think you've explained it well. I think that it's a good explanation that allows horse people to have another look at donkeys. Something that if they've thought about donkeys before and then they think, right, and even horse people will look and just its ears or the look in its eye and things. But a more experienced horse person is going to look for the very subtle signs. Horses are very obvious if they don't want to do something, or if they're in fear or pain or something, they can be a lot more obvious. But yes, training ourselves to look a little bit closer at donkey is probably a good thing for us to do.
Yes.
Now, you talked about donkeys in the wild in Australia. How many donkeys do you think there are in the wild in Australia?
So this is probably, as someone that, when I got into donkeys, this is probably one of the most heartbreaking parts about donkeys in Australia. So I came from Whaler horses. So when I realized that there were donkeys in Australia's history, I was absolutely fascinated because of the sort of synergy with the story of the Whalers. So I looked into it more, and estimations will vary because donkeys are hard to find in the desert because they're desert adapted. There's millions running wild in Australia. So where they came from was They came into the colonies in, I think, the late 1800s. And there's a thing called Kimberley walkabout disease in the outback, which is fatal to horses. It comes from a thing called the rattle pod. And if a horse eats it, it'll kill it. Donkeys either don't eat the rattle pod or are immune to this disease. So Beltana Station, Thomas Elder, he brought in a bunch of donkeys and hitched them up to carts. And that's how they actually supplied the inland towns in Australia, was actually using teams of donkeys. So they were used up until the 40s with mechanization, and they were turned loose. Now, these are a desert-adapted animal. This is why they were so fantastic at supplying the outback stations. And so there's now quite a large number of them. And they are classified certainly in WA and probably in other states, as a feral pest, which means they are offered very limited welfare protections. So they are usually shot. That's how they are managed. Or there's a thing called the Judas donkey, which is where they will tag a donkey, a Jenny usually, female donkey, and because Jennies are very sociable, she will run, she will find another group of Jennies, they will follow her, they will cull the donkeys that she finds, and this will go on until all the donkeys in the area are cleared out, and then she will be euthanized. And of course, there's a lot of outcry about the Brumbies, but because most people aren't aware of the donkeys being out there and what's going on, they don't have the same protections. In addition, there's a worldwide problem with something called ejiao, which is a traditional Chinese medicine that is made from donkey hides. They boil the donkey hides down to get a gelatin. This is actually causing a worldwide donkey welfare problem as the Chinese market hunts for sources of donkey hides. And Barnaby Joyce was quoted as saying that if this was a few years ago, that if the Chinese wanted donkey hides, we have donkey hides, we'll sell them. At the moment, as far as we are aware, there is no donkey hide export happening out of Australia, but this is something else that people aren't really aware of about the ejiao trade. It's somehow flying below the radar of many equine lovers' concerns, but it is actually a worldwide concern. And, Australia has a lot of donkeys in it that no one seems to be particularly concerned about. And it is a worry that the Chinese may come in and start trying to harvest our donkey herds.
So mainly, do you think, because you said Barnaby Joyce is out of Queensland, Victoria, Western Australia, is it every state and territory that you think's got donkeys? Or
they are a desert animal. They are not waterproof like a horse, so they really thrive in desert conditions. So it's really outback South Australia, outback Queensland, the Northern Territory, and WA. So I don't believe we have any wild donkey herds in Victoria because that's an alpine area. But certainly WA has a large feral donkey population, and I believe the Northern Territory do as well.
The reason I said Victoria is because I thought, well, you're from Victoria, and you got them from a wild herd.
Mine came from South Australia. So there was a contractor that was bringing them down. He did have connections to Chinese investors. I don't believe he's bringing donkeys down anymore, but they do appear periodically. There'll be small mobs of usually jacks that will appear in the marketplace where no one really knows where they came from.
And did you say there's a number?
It's in the millions, but it varies. It's hard to count them. If you look at a wild donkey in the outback, that grey fur that stands out really obviously against a green pasture, it's not obvious at all against a more muted landscape.
So within the Donkey Society, one of their aims is to help with the welfare of donkeys. So tell us a bit about the welfare and what sort of problems there are and what we, as a horse person or horse people, can do to assist their equine cousins.
So the Donkey Society actually formed 50 years ago in response to catching of wild donkeys, their transport around into potentially unsafe situations. So 50 years ago, the only real donkey breed you could get in Australia was what we call the Australian Teamster donkey, which is the wild caught donkeys. There's now 4 breeds commonly found in Australia. There's the Australian Teamster, the American Mammoth Jackstock, the Mediterranean Miniature, and the English Irish. So they come in. The Mediterranean Miniature is a mini-sized animal, and I think we have some American Mammoths up around 16 hands now in Australia. So they come in every size from little pony up to horse. Probably the most frequent call that we get is somebody that bought an unhandled wild caught donkey from a sale or situation, and they now cannot catch it or do anything with it. So that's a frequent problem.
Okay, so the involvement of these breeds, have they been from donkeys coming into Australia as donkeys have kept breeding? They've just shown 4 distinct types.
There's hundreds of breeds of donkey in the world. The ones that we have in Australia, I think Novington Benjamin was the first English-Irish. He was brought in the mid-70s. I think the Mediterranean miniatures, I think they originate in Greece. I think they were brought in the 90s. The American Mammoth was reintroduced to Australia. So they were around in colonial Australia because they're used to breed the big mules. They were reintroduced in 1999 when the Streifkirks imported Coakley Major Leo from the US. So they're not Australian-derived breeds. They are ones that have been imported. The only Australian-derived breed is the Australian Teamster, which is the one that's descended from the outback herds.
From the original. Where were they imported from, do you know?
All sorts of places. My COVID baby was a book called The Australian Teamster, where I researched it. So they were donkeys from America, from Spain, colonial breeders. They bred for a purpose, so they would import what they felt they needed to do to create the animal that was required. But I recently came back from a trip to America, and I went to a town called Oatman, which is famous for its wild donkeys, and they're the burro, the American wild donkey, and they're distinct from the Teamster. Teamster looks different. So the one we got in Australia is slightly different to the American version.
Now, just in case people are interested to know a bit more about your book, what we'll do is we'll put those on your page. So at Horse Chats, we have a different page for every episode that we do. So it'll be horsechats.com, and then just search for Chase, search for Day, and probably search for Donkey, and you'll find Chase's details for this episode. And then at the bottom of the page, we'll put down details about the book if you're interested in the book. But just tell us a bit more about the actual book itself, Chase.
So I like to read, and I've got, when I bought a whaler, there was books about the whalers and about World War I and the light horse. When I bought a standard bred, I bought books about the standard bred and about harness racing. So I did a similar thing when I started getting into the Teamsters, and I went looking around, and my dear friend Ruth Walker, her mother Anne Walker, had written a book about, it's actually called A Joy of Wild Asses, which I think is absolutely wonderful, but it was long out of print. And another lady whose name I can't remember at the moment, she'd written a book, but again, out of print. So when lockdown happened and I was sort of confined to quarters, as everyone was at the time, I started researching a book and the wild donkeys. And an interesting sort of side note to that was I'd always been a bit on the fence with the Brumby argument and stuff. And when I was researching my book and I came upon, the idea of compassionate conservation and thinking about problem solving rather than about sticking animals in particular columns of native and non-native, it really did change the way I think about non-native animals and how they should be managed.
Waterproof. You said donkeys aren't waterproof.
So yeah, they don't have the same oils in their coat as a horse does. So it's really important if you have a donkey to make sure that they have a shelter or are rugged to help keep them warm and dry. And this is one of the first talks that I'm doing at Equitana, is basically going through all the differences or some of the differences between horses and donkeys, because some of them are really quite fascinating. And yeah, one of them is they're not as waterproof as a horse. Obviously, it varies. I mean, I've got a young donkey I bought from New Zealand, and she's a purebred American mammoth, and she's quite happy to stand out in the rain. But the Teamsters, the ones from Outback, they do not want a bar of the rain. As soon as there's even a drop, they are in the shelter, and yeah.
What else can you tell me about the care of donkeys that's going to be different to horses?
So they are nutritionally more along the lines of a pony, so they don't need as much nutrition. So it's really important to make sure that they're not getting too much rich feed, because they can founder and have the same fat problems as a pony would. They are also not a grazer, they're a browser. So I usually put a call out around my community for specific species of tree prunings or rose clippings. My neighbor has a hazelnut grove, and every year he prunes his hazelnut trees and brings the branches over, and my donkeys have an absolute field day. We had a blackberry bush in one of the paddocks. We don't have a blackberry bush anymore. The downside of this is they will also be like beavers on the fences. So that is something that can be a little bit of a downside. But yeah, they rough feed. Straw can often be fed instead of hay because they do not have the same energy requirements as a horse does. And they like to eat branches and bark and tougher stuff. Yeah.
I've got some friends who've got some goats, and the dingoes kept coming and getting the goats, getting the young goats and getting the goats. And someone told them to put a donkey in the paddock with the goats. And they thought, what good is that going to do? You know, a donkey in the paddock with the goats. You know, it's just the person was trying to give them away a donkey. And they put the donkey in there. And ever since then, they've never lost any goats because the donkey just stands up for the goats, you know, chases away the dingoes and protects them.
Yes, so livestock guarding is a proposed use for donkeys. There's an organisation up in Singleton in New South Wales called Last Stop Donkey Program that has been helping people source potential livestock guarding donkeys for their herds. So it's a tricky one because there's pros and cons. There's a couple of issues that sort of have to be addressed. I mean, the first one is that the donkey is still going to get its needs met. You know, they do still require their feet to be done, their teeth to be done, they need to be wormed. So they, you know, as long as the person that's taking on a donkey for those needs is aware of that. The second one can be that certainly the male donkeys play rough. I see a lot of videos that people share to me of donkeys playing with rubber chickens, with balls, and people think it's cute. And it is cute, but it's also, I sometimes think to myself, geez, I bet that donkey would like another donkey to play with. My two geldings, they beat on each other. So that can be a problem with livestock guarding. If the donkey wants to play and there isn't anything else to play with, it might try to play with a sheep or a goat or something much smaller than itself. They do hate dogs for the most part, and they are effective. But unlike sort of a Maremma, they don't necessarily protect the herd. They're removing a threat that they perceive. So anybody looking at getting into livestock guarding, I would suggest that they research it thoroughly and approach somewhere like Last Stop that does work on actually providing guardian donkeys, because not every donkey will perform that function. And the last thing we want is somebody getting a donkey that doesn't do the job it was bought for, and then that becomes an issue because they've now got this donkey that they don't want or cannot care for properly. So that is definitely a up and coming proposal for what donkeys can be used for, but I urge people to look into it really thoroughly before they decide to go down that path, because there are pros and cons. I mean, my former Jack, he would livestock guard. He does not like dogs in the property, and he will actually stand on guard. You can see him looking. His son that we bred would be useless. He's not patrolling anything. So yeah, it is something that they do. And certainly people that have donkeys, be careful with how the dogs access the paddock and making sure that that's all tested thoroughly before you allow your dogs to mix in with the donkeys.
So apart from riding and being a guard, is there anything else that you say will donkeys excel at this particular line of work?
I think I'll just touch on riding for a second. I've transitioned to riding a donkey. I've been very blessed to be leased a fabulous donkey called Susanna. She's about 14 hands tall. She was already thoroughly educated when I got her, and I would ride this donkey into the gates of hell. I am the most nervous rider you've ever met in your life. Pretty much everything terrifies me. And I've led parades on this donkey. I've tried to joust train on this donkey. If you are someone that's a bit nervous as a rider, I cannot strongly emphasize to you, look into a donkey, because that stoicism, that thinking about things before you spook, is an absolute blessing if you're someone that's a bit nervous. There's people that carriage drive donkeys. There's people that use them for packing. There's the livestock guarding. I mean, the miniature community have them as pets that they enjoy. They just enjoy having them as companions. And minis, again, because of their strength to size ratio, can also often pull a small cart or be ridden by a child. So pretty much if you can do it with a horse, an equivalently sized donkey will do it. I mean, they aren't as athletic as a horse. They're not going to be flashy in the dressage ring. They don't have that extravagant movement, but they'll do a dressage test with you if you want to have a bit of fun on them. And I think not everybody wants to, do Grand Prix dressage. Some people just want to have a nice time and feel safe. And donkeys are great for that. And the other thing is they are much more affectionate than humans. I work a very stressful job, and I go out in the paddock, and I can go and stand with my horses, and they can turn and look at me. I don't have a treat. They're not interested. The donkeys, as soon as they see me, they come wandering over. And Shinto, the one we bred, he likes to lean on me, not in a like going to push you over, but he just comes up and he just stands next to me, just leans on me. Doesn't want a treat, doesn't want anything. He just wants to lean on. And that can be such a lovely experience that they just want to hang out with people. And we've had guests visit us that are terrified of horses, and they go and they stand with the donkeys, and they say the energy of these animals, it's so low. They're not pushing each other, they're not kicking each other, no one's trying to bite anybody. They're just hanging out. And sometimes having an animal that you can just go and hang out with is wonderful, you know?
Have they been used in equine assisted learning, equine assisted therapy, anything like that? Would you recommend that, not recommend that? Just tell us a bit about it.
There was an organization, there's a huge donkey charity called the Donkey Sanctuary out of the UK. They are pretty much the world leader on donkeys. I mean, if I will ring them if I have a problem with my donkeys. They can get, your vet can ring them. They're amazing. And it was called Slade House originally. I think it might now be back reincorporated just as the branding of the Donkey Sanctuary. I'm not across its current status, but they were using years ago donkeys for riding for the disabled and things like that because of their calm nature. I mean, for a child or somebody with mobility issues or balance issues, because they are slower and calmer than a horse, they are incredible.
Chase, is there anything I should have asked you but haven't asked you? Anything else that you'd like to say?
I just think they're not going to be for everyone. There's niches in the equine world that a donkey's probably not going to fill. And of course, then there's also mules, which is that would be a whole podcast in and of itself. But I think it's for people to be open to considering a donkey might be something that would work for them. I mean, certainly for children, they're amazing. It can be harder to find the big ones. I will put that caveat out there that they are rare and can be quite difficult to source, but well worth the effort if you do find one, because I've got, as I said, 2 of them and they're amazing. So, and if you do come across a donkey or think about a donkey, it's just to remember to approach the donkey as a donkey. It's not a horse. It is an equine, so don't be scared of it. If you have some horse training or horse experience, you're going to have a really good start on donkeys, but they aren't a horse. So also be prepared to think outside the box if your horse training doesn't work. And the donkey community are passionate. So reach out to us, reach out to a donkey society in your state. If you're not in Victoria, there's a donkey society in Queensland. There's a donkey society in WA. There's also the Donkey All Breed Society of Australia, which is another donkey organization. So there's always people thrilled to be able to help and offer advice, because we want to make sure that every donkey has an excellent outcome for its life. So we will be more than happy to help someone if they do have a donkey and things aren't working as well as they'd hoped. Do not be scared to reach out. I guess it's like, don't be scared to have a donkey, but also don't be thinking that, everything's going to be perfect. If things do go a little bit skewy. I mean, I've had it happen when I got my donkeys. I was thinking one was, I thought, oh, she's being stubborn. And she wasn't. She was just scared. And I couldn't read her signs because she was subtle. And a donkey experienced friend came out and said, you're handling this wrong. She's not being difficult. She's being frightened. So we rethought how we were approaching the problem to deal with it as from a point of view of fear rather than a point of view of belligerence, and got her in a flow. So
great. Now, if people would like to contact you, we normally put, and I said before that we have a page for this episode, and people just need to go to horsechats.com and search for your name, search for donkey, and they should be able to find that okay. But if they do need to contact you, what's the best way?
So we have a website, which is, I think it's donkey.org.au. And we have a Facebook page, which is Facebook group, which is Donkey Society of Victoria. We do have a Facebook page as well. Our group has over 2,000 members on Facebook. So that's a really good place to start to find us. I'm the face of the Donkey Society for Equitana purposes, but I'm certainly not the most experienced donkey person by any stretch of the imagination. So it'd be more beneficial for people to reach out to the donkey community rather than than just to me, because I might not be the best person. I mean, sometimes knowing a little can be worse than knowing a lot. So, and training is definitely not my forte. So if it's a training issue, there's definitely far more experienced donkey trainers than myself. So I would reach out to the Donkey Society through either our website or our Facebook page. And we have members, because sadly there were a few societies that had to merge with us. We do cover South Australia and bits of New South Wales and Tasmania as well, because they don't have their own donkey societies anymore.
Okay. And to do with the book too, we'll put the links to that on the page. So thank you, Chase. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for giving us a much better understanding about donkeys, not just their nature, but also just their care and their needs. I think that's important as well. So thank you for coming on. And yes, we'd love to talk about mules in an episode in the future. So thank you.
I would have to tell you, I am not a mule expert, but I would be happy to link you up with people that could talk to you about mules, because I do know some people in the mule world. So